we've had to switch platforms and I hear people clicking on, so we'll give just a few more seconds here for people to log on, and then we'll begin. All right, we'll go ahead and begin. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sam Lillard, and I also have with me my colleague, Matt Parker. We are partners with the law firm of Fisher & Phillips, and we're going to talk today about practical U.S. employer policies for managing an increasingly armed workforce. Now, as most of you know, Fisher & Phillips is a management-only labor and employment firm, and we're a national firm. So we have offices from California to New York and most of the states in between. And as a result of that, Matt and I practice in a variety of states, including California and New York. But we are both located here in Columbus, Ohio. So we do have a Midwest bent, which I think is fine for this topic. Nice thing about working with a national firm is you get to see trends that float across the country and eventually end up in the Midwest, either from New York or California. With this topic, though, it is a serious, national problem that we're facing and trying to resolve. This presentation came about from a recent client question, and that question to me was, hey, we are seeing a lot of workplace shootings. And the question was, is there anything that we should be doing to prevent them? A very simple, straightforward question. And of course, Matt and I did what we typically do when asked such questions. We look closely at the data, see if we can see whether there are correlations and find out who's doing it well, and then try to provide practical solutions. And we did, right? After looking at the data, looking at who's doing what and why, we said, yes, there is things that you can do. And what you should be doing is looking for the warning signs in your workforce for suicide, include them in your investigation processes, and then take reasonable steps and appropriate action when you encounter them. And we'll talk more about it. But what we're going to do today, and in fact, this is our roadmap. I'm going to first talk about the conclusion. Matt and I like to start off by telling you the conclusion and then work backwards and then state it again. And then we're going to talk about the data that we looked at. Now, I put in a lot of data. I put most of the graphs and the information that we looked at, not all of it, but most of it in here for you. And I'm going to go through it very, very fast. You may see things that you're saying, hey, I'd like to look at that a little more, talk a little more about it. Hey, just ask us for this PowerPoint. It's all in there. We'll be happy to give it to you. I do recommend that you get a copy of our PowerPoint, look at the data yourself. There's a lot more conclusions you can derive from it than what we're going to cover. We're also going to look at, well, who else is managing a well-armed workforce? Well, the U.S. military. In fact, the Ohio National Guard has provided us with some good support in how they manage this. We're going to talk a little bit about it. We're also going to talk about what is the law? What legal issues constrain you as an employer for taking steps to manage your workforce in the private sector? Not a lot, but we'll talk about that. And then we're going to look at OSHA and how OSHA views this issue. Matt's going to talk about that. And then we're going to come back again and go over the conclusions of what are the practical policies that you should do to stem the rising tide of workplace violence and shootings. All right. So let's start with the conclusion. We're going to come back to this at the end, but let me start it out. So in 2019, there were 841 workplace fatalities from violence. Okay, 841. 307 of those workplace violent deaths of employees were suicide. Okay? Almost half. And our conclusion after looking at the data is that there appears to be a strong correlation between the epidemic of male gun suicides in this country and workplace shootings. And what we're recommending, and here are the practical policies we'll go over at the end of this, but what we're recommending is that you, for your normal investigative processes, and these are the processes that you all should have to investigate allegations of sexual harassment, discrimination, workplace bullying, employee misconduct, but include in those also looking for the warning signs for workplace suicide. And that is changes in behavior such as difficult thinking, fatigue or loss of energy, decreased productivity, absenteeism, suicidal statements, or trouble sleeping. Look for those. If your employees or managers report to you or your investigative team, you should investigate those, and you should ask the question, have you thought about taking your own life? We don't ask that question, we need to be doing that. And if the answer is yes, you need to do what we refer to as the warm handoff. And we'll talk a little bit if that's needed. Okay, so let's back up a little bit, and since that's the conclusion, and talk about the data that we looked at. Now I'm gonna go really quick through this, so bear with me on that. I wanna give enough time to Matt to talk about OSHA. So we're gonna go quick. And again, if you want our slides, just let us know, and I recommend you take a look at it. But let's first look at gun ownership in the United States. Gun ownership really over the last 50 years hasn't changed that much. It's been hovering above 40% for almost 50 years, right? It goes a little high, goes a little low. The highest point here on this data slide between 1972 and 2020 is in 1990, where it hit about 47%. Right now it's at 42. There's some evidence that it's increasing right now, but we don't have that data yet, right? But it's been hovering consistently around 42%. If you look at gun ownership by registration by state in 2019, this tracks population, but Texas, it's not surprising, and Florida are the two highest states with the most amount of registered weapons. You got California and Virginia coming in there, and it goes all the way down the list. But the total registered weapons in the United States is 6.6 million, and possibly increasing this year. A little surprising to me is the statistics show that, I didn't know this, but every presidential election, there's a rash of gun buying. And we know there was 1.2 million gun purchase, new registrations or background checks, which is a sign of gun purchases. And 1/5 of those are new owners. So there may be some increase in this recently, but it's been pretty stable. So what does that mean? Well, it means the United States has the highest rate of civilian-owned firearms in the world. And in fact, we are double of that at the second country, which is Yemen, and we are well above any other country. So we're number one in that. And unfortunately, in the United States, homicides by firearm in 2019 is 10,000 individuals. But here's the kicker, and here's what we want to emphasize. Twice that number, more than twice that number, is suicides. 23,941. These are suicide by firearm. Well, let's look at homicides. And we're going to look at all the, what is the number one weapon used in the U.S. for murder? And that is, of course, as you would expect, handguns. If you look at the number of homicides in the United States over the last number of years, it has ranged around 9,000 to 10,000 a year, right? If you look at what we know about the causes of homicide and murder in the United States, the two number of reasons given is we just don't know why those murders occurred, or arguments. What's interesting from this is you'll note that there are not a lot of homicides related to other felonies committed. Burglary, arson, robbery, narcotics.
Click join this computer.
There's not a lot of...
Okay. I can hear it now.
Okay,
yeah,
you're good?
I'm good. All right. Thanks, King.
You're welcome.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
If you would please mute for us, I'd appreciate that. But there's not a lot of murders related to other felonies being committed. It's the number one cause is arguments. If you look at homicides by state, it tracks by population. California and Texas and Florida are the highest. If you skew it for population, the top states are the DC, Louisiana, and Mississippi, right? Ohio's pretty far down on that. But again, it's somewhat related to population. If you look at, and I just threw this in there because it's interesting, if you look at the most dangerous cities on the planet, you have mostly Latin American countries, but you'll notice in here you have creeped in St. Louis, Missouri, and Baltimore, Maryland. So mass shootings in the workplace. This is just a map of the mass shootings that have occurred in the United States in the last 5 months. And you notice we've included a very recent one, which is May 26th, 2021, where an employee walked into the transit authority in California and shot 9 of his coworkers, right? And this is a typical example if you look at the details on all of these and all the ones through U.S. history in the last 20 years, you'll see the same thing. Here we have an employee. He had a known history of bipolar and depression. He had actually written a manifesto listing a series of gripes about his coworkers and management. In fact, Homeland Security visited him in the past to talk to him about this manifesto. And then on May 26th, he set a bomb in his house, blew it up, it caught on fire. He went to work, he found the employees that he didn't like, he killed them, and then in front of police officers, he killed himself. Suicide. If you look at who's, in terms of ethnicities for who's committing suicide, it's majority white activity. If you look at gender, it's majority male. It's almost all male. If you look at the number of mass shootings where there are prior signs of mental health issues, you see that there's a high number that have had prior signs of having mental health problems. Now, I suggest to you this is really good news. That means if there are prior signs, then we can identify those signs, then we can maybe stop or prevent this type of violence happening at the workplace. Right? So unfortunately, that is somewhat good news. We just need a better idea of a better method of identifying those signs. Now, I threw this slide in there. It's not really on topic, but we also have in U.S., as you know, a major issue with school shootings. There's some suggestion from the data that this may simply be a juvenile problem associated with mass killing of adults, right? But it's also a big problem. So if you ask people and look at the statistic when we ask people what do they think is the cause of mass shooting, the number one answer is the failure of the mental health system to identify people who are a threat to others. Also access to guns. But I think this is correct. That is it is one of the major problems that we're just not identifying people that have mental health issues in mass shootings. So if we look at suicides now, and let's turn to that. As I indicated, if you look at the number of deaths and suicides in the U.S., for example, in 2018 by method, the number one method in the United States is firearms. Not here, but if you look across Western civilization, you'll note that the attempted suicide rate, across Western civilizations is about equal, but in the United States, we're far more successful. Again, that may be because we have access to firearms. Also, men are more successful in suicide than women, and that may be because women use a lot more poisoning than handguns than men do. And that may be one of the reasons for the male success in suicide to be much higher than women's. So if you bring all this together and look at a typical year, let's look at 2018, for all gun deaths in the United States, it jumps out to you that 61% of all the gun deaths in the United States is suicide. And this may be surprising to you, but if you look at the epidemic of white male suicide or male suicide, it's a little surprising the number of men, particularly white males, who shoot themselves at 75 or older. Now, going back to mass shootings at the workplace, this is just a graph showing the number of mass shootings based on the number of fatalities. And this list goes on and on. You can look this statistic up yourselves, but obviously the number one fatality involved El Paso Walmart case situation in 2019. There were 48 deaths in that incident. The second one in U.S. history was in 1986, involving a U.S. postal office in Oklahoma. And that 1986 incident is where we get the word going postal from, right? So from looking at this data, what are our conclusions? Our conclusions are that U.S. has the highest rate of civilian-owned firearms in the world. U.S. has almost 40,000 deaths by firearm each year, homicide and suicide. Most homicides are caused by arguments. A white male suicide by handgun is a real epidemic in the United States, twice that of homicides. Workplace shootings are still infrequent, but becoming routine in the United States. And, private employers have to recognize that they have a well-armed workforce. But the question that should arise is this, and I think the answer is clear. Are mass shootings and workplace shootings a product of the epidemic of male gun suicide? And for me, as I've been practicing for 30 years. I started my career as a prosecutor dealing with criminal issues. I was an assistant attorney general involving death penalty for the state of Ohio. In my career, it was the suicides that we dealt with always fell into 5 buckets. We had those who were suffering and they killed themselves. 2, we had those who were suffering, but they were concerned either about their family or blamed their family for their suffering, so they killed their family and then they killed themselves. There was a 3rd group that were suffering, they blamed specific others, and then they would kill them and then kill themselves. There was another group that were suffering, they were suffering alone, they were upset that no one knew that they were suffering, or they wanted to make a statement about their suffering, so they would kill everybody they could think they could, and then kill themselves. And then we had a group of individuals that were suffering, couldn't kill themselves, or bring themselves to kill themselves. Then they would engage in a series of behaviors, knowing that the police officers were likely to kill them, and we refer to them as suicide by cop. So I've always, from my experiences, put these type of suicides into 5 buckets. And when you look at a lot of the workplace shootings, they appear to be suicides of one of these categories, particularly at work. A list of grievances, what they're suffering, and they take it to work and then end their own lives. So what does the military say about this? And they are also an entity that is managing a very well armed workforce. And they're doing a lot. In fact, they're all over this. The U.S. military and the National Guard are highly aware that suicide is a big problem with their soldiers. They know it's a big problem that a suicidal soldier can also be homicidal. They train their leadership to look for health factors and warning signs. They train their leaders about the environmental factors and historical factors that could lead to suicide. And then if they have those signs, they take action to investigate, and they train their leadership to ask this question to those soldiers: have you ever thought about killing yourselves? And they also have a process, they train their leaders that if the answer is yes, then they do what they refer to as the warm handoff. And what is the warm handoff? That's that if they get a positive answer and they have the warning signs, then whoever receives that must escort that individual to help. Can't leave them alone. They do try to get handguns and other firearms away from the individual until they can get them to help. But they will take them to a counselor, a psychiatrist. They'll take them to the hospital. They'll even involve the police force, but they don't leave them alone or forget about them. The warm handoff means a warm body must now take action to get that individual help. Not a bad thing. And do they have help? Yes, they have a lot of resources that they have contracted with or have available to help soldiers who are having issues. Because again, they know that having a suicidal soldier or having not addressed this issue can really disrupt their mission, and it also can endanger their leadership as well as the other soldiers if it's not addressed. And these are some of the prevention sources that have been provided to us by the Ohio National Guard. Now, one of them up there is the Military Veterans Crisis Line, and that actually is the suicide crisis line. That's the 1-800-273-8255. Any of us can use that. It's also for any concern about civilian suicide. They're there to help. You can call that if you don't have any other resources available as a private employer and need help or to identify what to do. That's the number to call. Again, it's 1-800-273-8255. So those are statistics. Well, let's talk a little bit about what are the laws that exist out there that could limit you as a private employer from taking action in this area. Well, there are 4 laws that we can talk about. There are open carry laws. There are several states either are considering them or have them. Open carry laws, concealed carry laws. We have a rash of new laws involving either adding stand your ground defenses or removing them. And then we have what's referred to as the parking lot legislation. The first 3 here, the open carry, the concealed carry, and the stand your ground, aren't necessarily helpful to managing your workforce. But really what I should say about those is they don't have a direct impact on what you can do. In other words, there are no states that have open carry or concealed carry laws that prohibit you from prohibiting guns in your work facilities. None, all right? Just so you know that. However, there are now about half the states that do have parking lot legislation. And these are laws that say that employees have a right to have firearms in their car if they're locked in their trunk or glove compartment or just in the car, and then park it on your property in your parking lots. Half the states have these. And so let's talk a little bit about what those are. Each of the states have variations on this. The first state to have this was Minnesota, I think in 2004, and the most recent state is West Virginia. And they all say about the same, that the employee has a right to keep firearms in their car and take them to your parking lot, and are permitted to do that as long as they don't take them out of their car. Some of the states have strict rules that say they must be either locked in the glove compartment or locked in the trunk. Some say you must have a concealed carry. There's one state that doesn't have any of this. It just says that employers can't search cars in the parking lot for firearms, right? But though these state laws exist, it only requires you to tolerate gun possessions in cars in your parking lots. And again, there are no states that require you to allow concealed carry in your work facilities themselves. These laws aren't too impacting on what you can do to prevent this, as we're going to talk about in a minute. But you do need to know, our security experts say that when you have a termination where you also have security concerns, the best practice is to walk the employee not just out of your building, but also to their car so that they leave your facility. It's generally, if there are security concerns about a termination, not to just walk them out the front door and then lock it. It's to get them all the way to the car so that they leave your facility. You don't want them hanging around in the parking lot. But with these laws that exist on parking lots, there's a tension, because you're walking them to their car, where in some states, in half the states, they have a right to have handguns and firearms. Right? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and we're going to talk a little bit about OSHA.
Thanks, Sam. And I guess I'll just say next when I want you to click it. So now that we've got the data that Sam provided, let's go ahead and turn to workplace violence and some practical prevention steps. Go ahead and skip to the next, Sam. When it comes to the word workplace violence, especially recently, when you talk to most people in the US about it, they tend to think about active shooter incidents. But the concept really encompasses a whole lot more than that. And if you go looking for it, you can find many kinds of definitions for what actually constitutes workplace violence. But OSHA, for example, defines it as any act or threat of physical violence, harassment, intimidation, or other threatening, disruptive behavior that can occur at the work site. So it's not just limited to physical violence or threats of it, and it includes any other kinds of intimidating, abusive, or manipulative types of behavior that could occur in the workplace. So let's skip to the next slide, Sam. And when we, I think hit next. I don't think it moved. Sure. And so when we talk about workplace violence, there are 4 common categories of it: intimate partner violence, employee harms employee, client or customer harms an employee, or a stranger harms an employee. But for most employers, special attention is focused on the first 2, intimate partner or employee on employee, because those are the 2 types of incidents where we may see signs of it exhibit itself, manifest itself within the workplace. So when it comes to intimate partner violence, what that is any sort of violence by a domestic partner that happens to make its way into the workplace. And unfortunately, these issues are not entirely uncommon. When I recently checked the statistics on it, the CDC has reported that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men in their lifetime will experience some form of intimate partner violence. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics recently reported that approximately 40% of females that are killed in the workplace are killed by either a domestic partner or a relative. When it comes to employee on employee violence, what's interesting about that phenomenon is that perpetrators of employee on employee violence, they choose a target and they make threats not to that person directly, but usually to others about that target. And understanding that phenomenon is very critical to prevention. Just preventative measures that you can take to prevent that sort of violence from occurring in the workplace. And as Sam talked about earlier, and we'll talk about more throughout the presentation, it's imperative that employees are trained to understand when they hear threats, which most often will not be directed at them, that they know what to do in terms of reporting those so that they can be assessed and investigated so that appropriate measures can be taken. There's a lot of research out there that says a lot of times people might see something or hear something and not do anything, usually because they think that they're not experienced enough to do something about it. They think someone else will come along and do something about it, or they just think that there's nothing that they can do that'll make a difference. So that's why we'll talk about later the different types of training that you can provide to employees to make sure that they have the skill set to have the confidence to be able to recognize different warning signs, to know what the policies and procedures are for making reports of any warning signs that they might see, so that then the employer can take the appropriate action to investigate it and take any appropriate action that might need to happen. Okay, Sam, we can skip to the next. A lot of times what we see is whenever these incidents happen, Sam mentioned the recent workplace shooting out in Colorado, where there were signs along the way. Most of these incidents, when they happen, hindsight is 20/20, but you usually hear people say in retrospect, they noticed certain things stood out that could have been a red flag of something to come. And there are common, what we call red flags of both intimate partner and employee on employee violence that employees should know to be aware of, to watch for in the workplace. You want to advance the slide, Sam? When it comes to warning signs of intimate partner violence, what we typically see, which might suggest that someone is experiencing some form of domestic abuse in the workplace, we might see them reporting to work with repeated physical injuries, often attributing them to something like clumsiness or falling or an accident, increasing isolation, emotional distress, distracted, quality of work is inconsistent, taking a lot of personal phone calls, as well as absenteeism. I'm going to skip to the next one, Sam. And employee-on-employee violence signs, those occur and usually on an escalating continuum. As I mentioned before, one of the phenomena here is that it starts out as indirect threats. So for example, Mike might be mad at Tom and he goes to another coworker and says, if he doesn't knock it off, I'm gonna wait, to knock him out in the parking lot. And it might escalate from those indirect threats to loud outbursts, direct threats, confrontation of the target individually. We'll see mood and behavior changes, which could be tardiness, absences, issues with work performance, depression, becoming obsessed with firearms, just different changes from how that person used to present themselves within the workplace. And then finally, what we start to see at the end is signs of withdrawal. So you might see an employee taking down photos or packing up a desk. They might even mention suicide or thoughts of it, or even thoughts of harming other individuals or themselves within the workplace. As noted, no one ever just snaps. There are warning signs to workplace violence. And as we talked about and we'll talk about further, implementing a robust workplace violence prevention policy and training can help employees to identify these signs and report them to the appropriate people within the workplace. What we've seen is typically the lack of such a policy and procedures in place results in the inability of employees to come forth until it's too late. And then we're left with a situation where people are looking back in hindsight saying, yeah, this guy mentioned he had vendettas against these colleagues. We saw him becoming increasingly withdrawn from the workplace or these different changes. But they just didn't think to report it because they really weren't educated enough to recognize those signs and didn't know what to do about them. And again, while we cannot predict when this behavior will happen, the best that we can do is understand that these are risk factors that are present and can present themselves in the workplace, and that we can build in policies and practices so that we can assess them before something really bad happens and maybe make a difference that can save the life of that individual or save others in the workplace from harm. Sam, you can advance the slide. So now let's turn to legal obligations, and we can advance again. Starting on the state level, as you'll see, most states do not have significant requirements for private employers. Most states have no requirement that you implement a workplace violence policy. Most states do not have any requirement about prohibiting weapons in the workplace. And most states do not have any requirement on private employers to implement a plan to respond to workplace violence, including something like an active shooter incident. Nor does OSHA for that matter, although over the years it has provided guidance to employers on that issue. But the one main, state, I guess, common law duty requirement that you have as an employer is to exercise reasonable care to prevent foreseeable harm. And so whether something is foreseeable or not depends upon the circumstances, but usually requires some, element of knowledge on the part of the employer about some propensity to cause some sort of workplace violence. So that could be something like a red flag. It could be something that comes up in a background check report. or it could be threats in the workplace, anything that might suggest that someone is carrying out an act of a verbal or physical or other sort of intimidating behavior. And the failure to exercise reasonable care to prevent foreseeable harm can open an employer up to liabilities for different claims ranging from things like negligent hiring and retention, workers' compensation claims, breach of duty to warn. There are some Americans with Disabilities Act and some Title VII concerns as well. But the important thing here is that, to help avoid or mitigate the potential for liability and risk of harm to employees, it's important that you have policies and procedures in place so that you can take appropriate action, whether that's to warn or to handle a situation to prevent something bad from happening. And Sam, we can skip to the next. So now let's turn away from the states to federal guidance, specifically OSHA. And you could skip to the next. So what OSHA really provides is that its general duty clause can come into play when it comes to workplace violence. And under the general duty clause, employers must provide a workplace that's free from recognized hazards likely to cause death or serious harm. Courts have interpreted this obligation to create an obligation to do something where there's a feasible method to abate the hazard, and the failure to do so can result in a citation. Now, there's a lot of debate out there over what kinds of workplace violence constitutes a recognized hazards. Some people say it is, some say it's not, but it's worth noting that for OSHA's part, in January 2017, it issued an instruction which provided policy guidance and procedures to be followed by its inspectors when conducting investigations and issuing citations related to incidents of workplace violence. And then in the early 2000s, OSHA published a number of fact sheets on the issue of workplace violence itself. So there's certainly a debate going on out there as to whether it's a recognized hazard, whether there's a feasible method to abate it. But OSHA at least has taken the view that at least in some instances, workplace violence can trigger obligations under that general duty clause. So Sam, let's skip to the next. So a violation of the general duty clause occurs if a private employer failed to keep the workplace free of a hazard to which employees were exposed, the hazard was recognized, and it was causing or likely to cause serious harm, and there was a feasible and useful method to correct it. And we'll get into some of those useful and feasible methods to help kind of create this. And what we know from experience is that OSHA will routinely investigate workplace incidents if an employee dies or is hospitalized following a workplace event, such as an incident of workplace violence. So let's skip to the next slide, Sam. OSHA has certain reporting requirements, and it's no different when it comes to an incident of workplace violence. If someone dies in the workplace, as many on the line might know, that you're required to notify OSHA within 8 hours. If there's an inpatient hospitalization, amputation, loss of an eye, reported within 24 hours. And of course, the person making the report should know the legal entity, names of affected employees, the location and time of the incident, a brief description, and the point person for OSHA when making those reports. Okay, Sam, we can skip to the next. So when OSHA conducts an investigation of workplace violence, as noted, they will routinely do so if one or more employees dies or is hospitalized. The person that is conducting the investigation will review whether you have a written plan in place in policy addressing workplace violence and what to do in terms of reporting it within the organization, any injury illness records, information of training that individuals might have received, and any relevant training scheduled for the future, any other kinds of records that they feel might reveal instances of workplace violence. And in certain circumstances, they might look at employee records. But it's best to have all of these records organized prior to the time the investigation begins. These should be maintained for at least 5 years, and especially when it comes to trainings on anything about workplace safety, policy reports, accident logs, etc. Employees and supervisors who were exposed to the incident of workplace violence will be interviewed during the process. So we want to make sure that we're meeting with these individuals, and in particular, in something as serious as an incident of workplace violence, it's usually best at the outset to get outside counsel involved from the get-go to help compile records, prepare for the interviews, and deal with the investigator who might come on site. And if OSHA ultimately determines that there's a violation of the general duty clause, it will issue a citation. In this area of workplace violence, what we have seen is that when an employer has more training and has more thoughtful policies and practices around the issue of workplace violence, to either avoid or diminish the best that it can the effects or the occurrence of workplace violence, it's less likely that a citation will be issued in that situation. So what are you guys as employers to do in practical terms, in terms of preventative measures? And Sam, if we can skip ahead and we can continue to the next. We have a number of items that we would recommend that employers do, if you haven't done these already, to help address and take some sort of preventative steps when it comes to workplace violence. The first is to create a threat assessment team, and this is a team within an organization that is tasked with developing a definition of workplace violence, whether that aligns with how OSHA defines it or even broader, and also to establish your policy against workplace violence. They evaluate the workplace for safety issues. They make decisions necessary for keeping employees safe, such as reviewing an investigation into red flags, making an assessment as to whether there's a threat, what the level of that threat is, and how you as an organization should respond to it. We recommend that the team consists of a diverse array of individuals that come from all parts of the organization, so that you have the input of many different viewpoints when it comes to an issue such as safety in the workplace. Sam, you can go ahead and skip to the next. The next thing we suggest is to conduct a safety audit of your workplace. And this is really a physical analysis of the workplace. And the whole purpose of it is to identify potential risk factors and determine whether there are any physical changes that you might need to make to help make the workplace an even safer place for your workers. Some of the things that we will look into when it comes to a workplace safety audit are what are the access points of a building, who can gain access and how, do they have to punch in a code? Is it just an unlocked door? Do they have to swipe a badge or the like? Whether different parts of the building can be locked down, is there adequate lighting? Sometimes individuals might be required to work alone or late at night. Are there any issues or concerns that we might have in those situations for folks like that? You assess the need for alarms or panic buttons, ideal hiding places, and also alternative exits in the event of something like an active shooter incident. Okay, Sam, you can skip to the next. So we talk about the third step would be to create a documentation system. Usually the threat assessment team or somewhere like HR or legal or a safety team could maintain records concerning incidents of workplace violence. We identify a number of items that you might want to include in that documentation system but a lot of it deals with what is the company doing about the issue of workplace violence, and if there have ever been any incidents or complaints about the potential of it, how have you handled them? How have you responded to them, as well as any training that has been provided to employees on the issue of workplace violence, red flags, or what to do if they have to report, observing or hearing the occurrence of one of the red flags that we've talked about. Go to the next, Sam. And the fourth thing, and I probably should have put this first, because I personally think it's one of the most important thing, is that we conduct targeted trainings on this issue. And really, that's key. What we find is that these trainings should focus on things like the risk of workplace violence, how to recognize it as early as possible, and what to do if you do witness it. Topics that we would suggest including on this issue are training on your workplace violence policy, training on the complaint and investigation process, training on any workplace safety plan, training on warning signs or red flags, and then finally, bystander intervention training. And again, a lot of employers do training like this, but it's important to really do it conscientiously and to do it on, at least an annual basis. We noted earlier, when it comes to these incidents, whether it's a shooting in the workplace or some other form, there are usually warning signs of it that when people look back in retrospect, they will acknowledge that they saw or overheard something that maybe presented an issue. And the primary reasons that people do not come forward to report them is they don't feel like they have the skill set to recognize and do anything about it, or they think someone else will follow them and do something about it. But we want to make sure that everyone from the bottom to the top recognizes, just like what Sam and I talk about in anti-discrimination, harassment, prevention issues, that this is really something that's not just for HR or legal or safety, but everyone plays a key role here, and can do small things that may make a major difference preventing something bad from happening. And with these sorts of targeted trainings, we're very confident that employees will feel empowered. They will feel as though they have the skill set and know-how to report something when they recognize it in the workplace. And they'll also have the confidence that there are procedures and practices in place for the employer to investigate it, to assess the potential threat, and to take any sort of appropriate measures that might need to be taken. Sam, you can skip to the next. And then the final thing is just to be mindful of common stressors in the workplace. A lot of times where we might see someone resort to an incident of workplace violence, something like a layoff, a merger, different changes in workloads, new management, new technology coming in, discipline or termination. It's important to remember that in each of these stressful events, we're still dealing with human beings that will have certain responses to these incidents, and that they should still be treated with dignity and fairness through each of these processes, and that can help maybe alleviate some negative reaction or a drastic negative reaction. And on that note, in terms of being mindful to these different stressors, I'll turn it back to Sam, who can talk a little bit more about approaching these stressors with some semblance of dignity.
Yeah, so if you go back to the statistic we talked about early on, what's the number one cause for homicides? The number one is arguments. And unfortunately, a termination event can be a source of security threat. Now, again, most terminations are not, but there will come from time to time terminations that are. So we're going to talk a little bit about, how to terminate with dignity. We're not going to go into great detail, but just some of the basic points that you should consider. First of all, you should have a handbook. We think all private employers should have a handbook that includes immediate termination for anybody threatening others with brutality or perpetrate violent actions. Get them out of your workforce. By getting them out, they may seek help, and that helps to prevent it. Also, you shouldn't prohibit allowing employees to bring weapons to work, except if they're bringing them in their car in their parking lot. If you're in a state that has those laws, right? But you should have those in your policies. Now, I do have some clients who say, well, we do allow our management to have firearms. We don't see any value one way or the other with that. Just note that management is not immune from the epidemic of suicide as well, right? Terminations with dignity. Well, a couple of pointers on this. We have talked about this in other seminars, but our recommendations, if you're going to terminate, it's best to terminate employees early in the week as opposed to doing it on Friday in the afternoon. For the employee perspective, if you do it on a Friday, they germinate about this on Saturday and Sunday, and don't start to take practical steps to look for another job. And that can create stressors if you have some of the other warning signs that we talked about. Better to do it early in the week and early in the day. Where to terminate? Plan that out. You want to do it in private office, not public, close to an exit. Who should be present? You should have at least 2 people. Prefer mixed gender for a number of reasons. If you have security, you may have them involved, but keep them in the background. Sometimes having too much security can actually provoke issues when none occurred, right? If there are security concerns, and again, these are threats of violence or concerns about violence or issues related to violence or termination because of violence, then you want to arrange for the removal of employee's personal property before termination, so he doesn't have to go through the building to remove the property. Move other employees if necessary to safe locations. You can call the police. They will help you with this. You want plainclothes police officers nearby, out of sight only if necessary. And then the security experts tell us you want to walk the employee not just out the building, but to their car, and you want them to leave, right? Of course, the parking lot laws make that a little stressful, but and it's nice to have security if you're an employer that has those resources. But going back, so the practical policies. Now, I know we have on the call the lawyers and HR from very large companies that have a large investigative work staff, HR groups, and we have some that, the individual that's involved in HR and security and all about everything else is just one person. Right. So here are some practical policies that are scalable, and then we think that if you implement them, that can have an impact on preventing issues. Can't guarantee it, but we think it will. 1, you should not allow weapons at work. And again, at work in your facilities, there's an exception with parking lot. 2, you should terminate immediately for any actual threats of violence. Don't mess around with that. I mean, there's no reason to delay that. We see problems when you do, right? Except for very rare circumstances. You should have a system to receive and investigate employee suspect behavior. We recommend all employers have an investigative process where you are receiving information from employees and managers about things of concern, right? What? Sexual harassment, workplace bullying, employee misconduct, drug use, and including warning signs for employee suicide. And you should have those signs down, and here they are. And again, the warning signs are reports to you, HR or your investigative processes, warning signs about changes of behavior. Now, if the employee has always had these behaviors, may not be concerned, but if an employee is reported to have, hey, Bob now is really has difficult thinking and saying he's low energy, and it's really his mood and productivity has drastically changed. If you're getting warning signs, difficult thinking, fatigue or loss of energy, decreased productivity, absenteeism, if he's making suicidal statements or reporting trouble sleeping, these are warning signs that maybe you should step in and bring the employee in and ask, this is what we're seeing or hearing. We're hearing that you have lost, you're taking a lot of time off, you're reporting that you're having trouble sleeping, anything we can do to help, what's going on. Nothing wrong with you doing that. Now again, as you know, employers under the Americans Disabilities Act and a lot of state laws are not allowed to ask about disability or pre-existing conditions. But you can always ask about behavior. Okay. If there are 5 or more of these warning signs, these could be serious. But here's the catch that we don't often see, and I think this may be new to you. You should ask, if you have these warning signs, this question. And this comes from, I appreciate the Ohio National Guard providing us with information about what they're doing. This is what the military does. They think this is a very important question. Very important question. You should ask, if you're seeing these warning signs, have you ever thought of ending your life? Now, I'm aware of the ADA. We thought about that. You're not barred by that. This is about behavior, not disability. You're not asking, do you have depression or anything like that. This is asking a specific question based on what you're hearing or seeing. And if they say yes, then you want to engage in that warm handoff. Get them help. Call that suicide helpline. Know what resources that you have in your community before it ever occurs, before this occurs. And if you need to, call the police or get them to the hospital. But get them help if they answer yes to that. If they answer no, still get them help. Offer them help. Tell them what's available, who to go to, what the phone number is, and have that available list of community resources before you ever have to deal with this issue. We also recommend that you do have a tabletop meeting with local law enforcement. They love to do this, and you'll find out that there's actually a community liaison officer in most of your communities, not all, but most of them, that their job is to do that. They'll sit down with you and they'll talk to you about, what are the steps to take if you have a security concern or issues come up about concerning. They'll be there to help you. You'll know who they are. You know how to contact them. They'll love to come down and talk to you about that. It's a good thing to do, whether you're a small employer or large employer. We highly recommend that. And then if you have these warning signs, you should monitor until resolved. Now, I've listed also risk factors. These are things that you can take in information if you have the warning signs. But, the risk factors for suicidal behavior, pre-existing psychiatric disorders, you can't ask about it, but employees do tell you about those. Pre-existing health conditions, you can't ask about it, but of course they may tell you about that information. Loss of a family member, wife, child, can be a severe stressor. Changes at work, particularly those changes that create an economic negative impact on the employee, can be serious stressors. And major life changes, typically divorce or loss of custody of a child. So consider that. So here are our conclusions. As we've discussed, you should conduct an organizational violence assessment, train your managers and your investigative team on the warning signs. Again, it's change of behavior, erratic behavior of employees. Investigate those. A lot of the workplace shootings, there were these signs. No one investigated, took action. No one talked to the employee. I think had that occurred and they asked the question, have you ever thought about taking your life? They could have been stopped. Add to your list of questions. Have you thought of killing yourself or ending your own life? And be prepared to do the warm handoff if you get a positive answer. And then have already identified external resources that can help that employee and you. And again, if you don't know or have that available, you can always call that suicide hotline that we mentioned on the phone. All right. Now with that, we would be happy to take any questions as long as people are interested in doing that. You'll probably need to unmute. But if you want a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, these are our emails. Feel free to email us and we'll make sure you get a copy of it. I would recommend you take a look at the statistics yourself because they're quite interesting and they provide other insights into managing our workforce. Thank you. if there are any questions, we'd be happy to talk about here. All right, hearing no questions, Matt and I appreciate your attention. Again, if you want a copy of this PowerPoint presentation, just email either Matt or myself, and we'll make sure you get a copy of that. And have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.